Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, Principal Atmospheric Scientist with Nutrient Ag Solutions, and I want to thank you for watching this weekly Ag Weather Update brought to you by the Farm Credit Associations of North Carolina. I got three things I'd like to present to you today. We're going to discuss first the new climate normals that were released by NOAA last week. We're going to then get into our normal 2-week weather outlook, and we're going to finish up with some new long-range data from the European model. So, these climate normals, what are they? Well, once a decade, we update what it means to be average in terms of weather. And we do that by incorporating 15,000 different weather stations that collect weather data every single day, and we use it to kind of understand any sort of longer term shifts in weather patterns or climate patterns. And what I want to discuss with you today is the newest updates. So what did we update? We had data from 1981 to 2010 in our 30-year climatological average data set up until we just released the new 1991 to 2020. And why this is important, again, is it tells us the longer term patterns, but two, anytime that I create a map that gives you an anomaly or a difference from normal, that's what I'm comparing it to, is these 30-year histories. Now, on this website here, which kind of details out what NOAA released, down at the bottom they have two graphics. They're going to look at the annual mean temperature change, so the change in the average yearly temperature, and the same thing for precipitation. So let's go take a look at them, all right? Let's start off with the annual mean temperature change. You look across much of the United States, and we see that when we add the last decade into the data set, it has basically given us a warmer bias by about half a degree, and in some locations up to a degree a little bit more. Now you notice that in the mid-Atlantic and the Carolinas, that's where we typically sit, about a half a degree to a degree increase in our total average temperature for the entirety of the year. Where it's been cooler, well, pockets of the northern plains, and a lot of this up here is coming in spring, which means that particular area, because of the cooler weather in spring, is not exactly seeing the real rapid starts to the growing season, which we would, of course, want in that area. But let's go from there over to the precipitation discussion. So this next graphic shows you annual precipitation change. Notice that if you're east of the Rocky Mountains, the likelihood of seeing above average precipitation or an increase in above average precipitation is there. By how much? Well, in some places 5 to 10%. In the desert Southwest and along the West Coast, we actually see a reduction of upwards of 10% there. And what I'd like to do is I want to just take a moment and kind of talk with you about why we're observing these changes. And let's go take a look at it, all right? So first, North Carolina, November to April. You see, with that rich history of data, which goes all the way back into the late 1800s, I can reconstruct your cold season precipitation patterns. And that's what I've got here, November to April. So each dot represents a different year. And I put a blue line at the very end of this, which shows you the trend line over the last decade. Our cold season precipitation in North Carolina is increasing to the tune of about 0.6 of an inch per decade. And certainly the last November to April time period, so 2020 into 2021, has actually been quite wet compared to normal. All right, we're well above normal here by about 5 inches. All right. Now let's do this same analysis, but instead look from April to November. So I'm going to go up to the top here, and we're going to change this to an 8-month time period, and we're going to look April all the way to November. We'll call that our primary growing season. And when we look at that time period, there is a much more substantial shift we have to be aware of. This is the 1990 to 2020 trend line. And over that time period, it's increased by almost 2.5 inches per decade. And yes, a lot of this has to do with hurricane activity, but a lot of this is also thunderstorms, and a lot of this is a more conducive pattern to, well, our warm season precipitation. And we better just take a moment to understand what has changed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the jet stream level winds. Now, at first glance, a map like this doesn't really convey much information, but what I'm looking at here are shifts in the behavior of the jet stream, and I'm noticing a few things. Around the Aleutian Islands, there's a shift. Along the west coast, there's a significant change in the pattern, and here in the North Atlantic, just south of Iceland, the Icelandic low seems to be getting stronger. Now, what is the consequence of that? Well, this is what it did to our pattern. When looking at June to September, so summer, from 1990 to 2020, let's compare that time period to the very long-term average. And what I see is this. These areas where I'm putting the L's are regions where the upper level heights, or you can just think of this as pressure patterns, have either remained normal or have gotten lower. And what we need to do is compare that to these areas, like off the Aleutian Islands, the west coast, and here between like Greenland and Hudson Bay, where pressures have increased or heights have increased. Now, what does this do? Well, this typically gives us a jet stream pattern that comes more quickly through the Gulf of Alaska, runs over a ridge in the west, and then comes out of the northwest here across the eastern part of the United States. The result of that is a cooler pattern at certain times of the year and a lot more thunderstorm activity, stretching from the Dakotas here into the Appalachian Mountains. Now, what this really signals in this area is a lot more increased activity with precipitation, while the west seeing more ridges would go over to a drier pattern, and we have most certainly seen that in the west. Now, with that as the setup, let's go take a look at another important piece to this. It's in the North Pacific, and what I have graphed for you here is the top 300 feet of temperature anomalies. It's upper ocean heat content. I fitted a polynomial fit to this and also a linear trend line, that's the dash line. And what we've seen is that since the 70s and 80s, there has been a pretty remarkable increase in upper ocean heat content in the North Pacific. Now, what does that look like? It looks like this. You see, May 8th, this is the latest satellite data we have for ocean temperatures. You see the warmer waters that are in place right here? This has been an area where over the last 50 years, we have seen an increase in ocean temperatures. And as a result of that, that is perturbing or changing the flow of the jet stream, putting more ridges on the west coast and more troughs over the east. The net effect of that is to increase our precipitation pattern. At the same time, if we're also warming the North Atlantic, that increases the energy and moisture content of any would-be tropical cyclone that comes into the East Coast. And certainly North Carolina is one of the places along the East Coast that has the greatest frequency of tropical cyclones making landfall. That's the first component to this, okay? When we continue to broaden this out, let's at least look at the near term before we kind of get this second idea down here. In the near term, over the last 180 days, we are looking here at a temperature graph. So what do I get out of those normals? I get this line right here. That's your average daily temperature over the last 180 days. I'm looking at this for Raleigh, North Carolina. So you can see the blue dips, that was when it was cool, and the big red spikes up is when it was warm. Now, using that same idea, I can also show you below this what the the precipitation patterns have done. And if you look, that would be your average precipitation, and the green shading tells you what you are compared to average. We are currently, when looking back over the last 125 days, at 180 days, we're at 125% of normal on precip. But you can see that a lot of that was back here. And lately, we've been dry. Now, when we think about these longer-term shifts, the other component to this is not just the jet stream in the North Pacific. It's the position and strength of the Bermuda High. Now, tuck that away in the back of your mind, because at the very end of this, I'm going to talk about that. Where that high moves around to ultimately affects our precipitation patterns. And right now, even though it's wet on the long term, we've been drier in parts of North Carolina as of late. So let's take a look at some of those stats. November to April. We currently, over that time period, sit at 109th out of 127 years. But remember, much of that precip was back in winter. Now, who's been dry? North Dakota, driest on record. California, 5th driest on record. In fact, they only got about 50% of the normal precip over the last 6 months. And if you look at temperatures, overall, we'd say things have been mild here in North Carolina and above average in the Great Lakes and Northern Plains. In fact, much of the United States had an above average temperature winter, despite the brutal Arctic air that came out in February. Okay? From there, let's see what April's given us. Well, April has been a very difficult month for me to forecast. And the cooler air that has been let out at times, clear from the northern plains all the way to the East Coast, was something that was not well forecast by me personally back in March. I just didn't see April turning out this way. I thought April was going to be much more mild. This just shows you how month-to-month weather forecasting is so very challenging. And as a consequence of that, look at our growing degree day anomaly map. Now, while we're sitting generally here about 30 to 50 GDUs above normal since April 1st, look at the southern plains, parts of the cotton belt where we grow a lot of sorghum as well, our winter wheat belt, and even where we put in corn and soybeans down here in Texas. We are sitting well behind, upwards in some locations of almost 100 GDUs below normal. whereas West Coast is much above average. And even though the Midwest is looking above average, we've had frost in this area as of late. And we'll certainly talk about that in just a few moments here. But let's come back to precip. This map shows the last 30 days in terms of percent of normal precipitation. I'm sure your eye sees what's going on the West Coast, which has had a very, very dry go of it in April. Pockets in the Midwest have been dry. But get down there into parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, then right there from eastern Texas all the way over to southern Georgia, extremely wet. These fronts have had a difficult time getting into the Carolinas, and there are pockets that have been very, very dry as a result of that. I have some good news in the near term on moisture return, but we have to be looking longer term, which we're going to do here in a few moments, about what this means as we stretch this out into our summer months. So what I want to look at first is radar data. This is what came through yesterday. You can see as I animate this forward, we had the widely scattered precip that came through in the early morning hours. I'm kind of rocking back and forth here, that stretched just like this from southwest to northeast across the state. And that rainfall coming through here was much needed in some places. We had a lot of severe weather on the backside of this over the weekend in Texas, in Kansas. And we have to ask ourselves what kind of moisture is on its way. Because through 8 a.m. Central Time this morning, while we did return some moisture here, the pattern is going to remain quite active as this low sets up here in the northeast and leaves a frontal boundary just like that, linking up with another low coming out of Colorado. Now, why this is significant is that's going to push more precip toward us following that frontal boundary throughout this week. And here's the jet stream level pattern that says how this is going to unfold. This is the trough I'm going to watch this week. And you can see the net flow in the jet stream level is just like that, which means this is going to push all of this toward us middle of this week. Meanwhile, to your north, see this anticyclone, this big high? It's going to slide over the Great Lakes states. And for you that farm corn and soybeans, you want to be paying attention to what the Midwest and upper Midwest are going to be seeing in terms of temperatures, because this is going to be a relatively late season frost event for some of us here. And at the very end of this, I'm going to talk about how this pattern shift here in the Pacific could start to increase precipitation chances for the Canadian Prairie and the Northern Plains. Now, today we do have the risk for some strong storms. As you can see here, the Storm Prediction Center has a slight risk out for pockets of North Carolina. Let's jump on in and take a look at that by going to some of our high-resolution modeling. Here's the precip early this morning. So this was through about, well, there it is through 10 a.m. So we were seeing that move on out. Now watch what's happening behind this. You see, there's going to be a lingering frontal boundary right in through here, such that by this evening, we're going to have to watch out for some isolated strong to severe storms. See them right there? And again, this is all sitting on this frontal boundary that links all the way back to Colorado. That's where that front ends, and where it begins is way up here, wrapped up into this cyclone going through the northeast. So storms move through tonight. And then what we're going to watch next is that low to come out of Colorado, and yes, snow in the high plains here. This is Tuesday morning. As we work our way through the day on Tuesday, there it is, see the low? Such that by Tuesday evening, getting into the overnight hours, and then early Wednesday morning, the moisture from that is pushed finally over here toward the Appalachian Mountains. It moves through South Carolina and pushes through North Carolina, bringing in more rainfall to those very dry regions. And that's exactly what we want to be seeing, to be honest with you. Now, it may ruin your midweek plans, but bringing in that moisture is fantastic. Here's the high, though, that many of us in the upper Midwest, in fact, this whole region I'm circling right here, are going to be look out for in terms of a frost. That high pressure center is going to help us with that. So let's go from there and talk about where the whole pattern goes. So this is jet stream level winds. Okay, we've already seen the stronger winds carrying that system over toward the Carolina coast. So let's just get past that. And now we're going to get toward Thursday and Friday. Now, unfortunately, this deeper trough that's in place here is going to sweep in some cooler air, but the pattern breaks in a big way after that. Now, I want you to watch a couple of things here. While we may relax a bit in our precipitation patterns, there is a trough here and a trough here, and a bigger one coming into the Gulf of Alaska. They're going to kind of sweep through the northern plains. This is going to open the transport of moisture up in the Gulf of Mexico, possibly return some precipitation to the northern plains, and also beat back the drought that's in the western half of the United States. Now, this is significant, given that a lot of what's happened in our market action on our big commodities like corn and soybeans has been partly driven by weather. And what I just told you is we're going to try to return some moisture to some areas that have been very, very dry based on this jet stream pattern. And the temperatures are going to rebound with this as well. So let's discuss that. Then we'll turn on the long range forecast and finish this up. So we've already seen through here. This is through Monday afternoon and evening. Now we're going to get into Tuesday morning, afternoon, and evening. We get through much of the day on Tuesday, drier. But then you notice as we go into the overnight hours, this is Wednesday morning, afternoon, and evening. That's when that push of moisture comes through right there in the day on Wednesday. As we work toward the end of the week, the high pressure moves over. We go cooler, but you do have a drier go of it on Thursday. Could be some scattered precip on Friday, as you see right here, as that stalled out frontal boundary finally exits. And then as we go into the weekend, we see that the next system is still pushing through the Midwest. And we get a mostly dry weekend. But the shift begins to happen once we get out here into early next week. So two things. There is a stalled out frontal boundary again, tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains over toward the Mid-Atlantic. This is early Monday morning. That could be bringing us some precip. But look at the change that's happening in the midsection of the country. As that little weak system moves out, giving us some precip, we now see the return of severe weather, moisture to the Central Plains, and as you saw back there, if I kind of rock back and forth, look at the Northern Plains. That's the first chance at precip I've seen there. Decent chance of precip getting through that area. So I'm telling you this for the corn and soybean growers that are listening to this video. So if we look at all of this together, watch total accumulated precip. There's the round 1 that comes through. Here comes round 2 there coming in early on Wednesday. So generally across the state, we're measuring anywhere between 0.3 of an inch and in some locations over an inch of total precip. And then things quiet down a little bit. Where we have our next chance at showers is going to be on Friday. And then we're going to wait until the next systems pull through the midsection of the country next week. And that little cutoff, well, it's not really cutoff, but it's riding along this boundary right in through here, comes through at the end of our weekend and starting on Monday, adding up our precip. So when I take you all the way out to next Monday evening in the forecast, you generally match up the colors here across North Carolina, and we see that we're sitting anywhere between 1/2 an inch, with some locations pushing 1.5 inches of total precip. But if I just let this keep going, look at that moisture return in the midsection of the country. Why is that happening? Well, the European model's given us a pretty good clue. Strong jet stream curling around the Aleutian Islands. Trough digging into the west. Ridge building here. Systems draw in that Gulf of Mexico moisture and light up the midsection of the country. Now, we know that these systems move our way eventually, but we have to see the timing of them here. So let's go look out at the European model. You see, for week 2, it makes this region the wettest region. Southern Plains, lower Mississippi River Valley. We would be on the drier side of this pattern as the trough digs in and lifts over the midsection of the country. Does the GFS see the same thing? It kind of does. See the jet stream pattern doing that? The ridges are building in. The return of the moisture is coming up like this. And the European model, you saw that it was drier for us, so is the GFS. So the week 2 GFS is even drier than the European from the lower Mississippi over toward the mid-Atlantic, whereas the European was wetter here, but not for us. So we could be going into a drier time period as we work our way into the 3rd week of this month. What we have to take account of right now, though, is we do have multiple chances of precip over the next 7 days. And that's the good news, because I don't want to go into this dry period given how dry things have been as of late. All right, let's keep going with this forecast. Temperatures, frosty morning here in the eastern Corn Belt and the upper Midwest. Let's keep going, though. Tuesday morning lows, another frost event right in through here. As we go into Wednesday, this is where things start to cool down for us. We might get our overnight lows down into the upper 30s with some low 40s around. Going into Friday, now we're moderating a bit, but still chilly overnight lows. There's Saturday and Sunday. High temps. Here's today's high temperatures, but you can see the cooler weather to your west. Tuesday, Wednesday is going to be our cold day here. Highs in Raleigh barely getting out of the upper 50s. There's Thursday, the rebound starts. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, we get back up there toward the upper 70s, possibly cracking into the low 80s. So we got a cooler go of it here. Looking out there, day 5 through 10, we're going to watch that cooler air exit to the east. and it's also echoed in the European model. Day 10 through 15, things really start to warm back up. You saw the ridge that built back in, and the European model sees the same thing. All right, so we got a cooler go of it this week, but then moderation takes over after that time period. Beyond this, some of the bigger picture things. Right now, given that La Nina has faded to nothing, okay, it's ENSO neutral, the North Pacific jet stream and the North Atlantic don't seem to be getting stuck in long-term blocks. I'm talking about 10-plus day blocks. The most important thing is coming out of the tropics with the MJO. And all I'd like to tell you is the MJO is moving out of the Indian Ocean and heading here in toward the Western Pacific. And generally speaking, that is a milder pattern, which means above average temperatures for us sliding through the rest of May and the start of June. Now, before I give you that long range stuff, can I give you another quick update on South America? Looking at some drought indicators, southern Brazil's growing area, and I just circled about 40% of the safrinha crop production is in drought. In fact, it may be the second or even first driest such time period on record. We're looking here over the last month or so. In the forecast for this area, this is what the next 10 days looks like. There's a chance for rain coming through Paraná. That's a state that has not seen moisture return here in the last 45 days. And just so that you're aware, you could fit the entire state of North Carolina inside of Paraná, which I've kind of put an oval around. Much of the rest of Brazil's safrinha crop, which is grown here, is going to be very dry throughout the next 10 days, and temperatures 2 to 7 degrees Celsius above average. So this is going to continue to put stress on the safrinha crop grown in Brazil. But from there, what I promised to finish with is the long-range update. Here we go. Brand new European update, June, July, August. You can see as I can that the model is attempting to keep the greatest heat in the northern and high plains back into the Pacific Northwest. We could have a mild summer compared to normal for us here in North Carolina, but if we slide this forward into now the July, August, September time period, and even out there to the heart of our hurricane season, the models really want to keep the greatest heat in the plains to the northwest. Now let's bring this back and let's go now look at precipitation patterns. What we've got here is the June, July, August precip patterns. The models are attempting to revive some sense of of the southwestern monsoon, and they continue to forecast an above average hurricane season. That's June, July, August precip. Let's now go out there again, July, August, September, and even out there to the heart of the hurricane season. This would be August, September, October. And again, we do see above average precipitation, across much of the eastern part of the United States here. And that's the latest long range from the European. What we need to do is look at that other component I told you about a few moments ago. So I'm going to show you this. Let's go over to an equatorial view. And once we get there, let's now look at ocean temperatures first. And what we see here is that the North Pacific remains very warm. That was expected. The North Atlantic also in September, October, August, September, October stays warm as well. What about midsummer? Let's just step it back one. Yeah, the North Atlantic being so warm is going to prime us for an active tropical cyclone season. And this is where I'm going to finish. Pressure anomalies. Now we need to look at this diagram carefully. Let's go here. Let's bring it back one set. There we go. June, July, and August. We're going to have to watch carefully where the subtropical high is going to sit, because the models continue to keep the western edge of the subtropical high with above average pressure. Now, what does that mean? That means the subtropical high could move closer to Bermuda. And if that happens, tropical systems tend to be pushed closer into our shoreline. And that is why we continue to see the above normal risk of tropical activity this upcoming summer and fall. And that narrative has not changed since the last time I shared it with you. Hey, thank you for sticking with me to the end here. We had a lot to cover today. Hope you found it instructive and useful, and I'll talk to you next Monday. Thanks.